Seafood Fund. The second part of this will be with the Minister, Victoria Prentice, and one of her officials. But in this first section, we've got three witnesses who I'd like to ask them to introduce themselves, starting with Dr. Bryce Stewart, and a little bit thumbnail of who you are and what you do, please.
Okay, thank you. So pleasure to be here. Yeah, I'm Dr. Bryce Stewart. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of York and Director for Engagement and Partnerships in the Department of Environment Geography. I am trained as a marine ecologist, but I've increasingly sort of broadened out into general issues around fisheries management and marine conservation.
Thank you. And Chloe North?
Hi, I'm Chloe North. I manage the Western Fish Producers Organisation, which is a cooperative of fishing companies mostly based in the southwest and covering a range of gear types.
And Helen McLaughlin?
Hi, thank you. I'm Helen McLaughlin, the Head of Marine Policy at RSPB, and I'm here today representing the views of the Future Fisheries Alliance, which is a partnership of Marine Conservation Society, WWF and RSPB.
Okay, and I must declare an interest. I'm species champion for the sand eel, which many of your feathered friends enjoy, certainly on the Yorkshire coast off Bempton Cliffs. So if I could start off the questioning, I think probably with Chloe, how well does the Seafood Fund cover the challenges facing the fishing industry and the living environment in which it operates? I guess the fishing industry part of that is the one you're most interested in.
Sure, yeah, so the most pressing challenge at the moment is probably quite obviously the fuel crisis, the price of fuel and access to crew and skippers. And the fuel crisis is exacerbating the crewing issue. I've got members that are working for £37 a day at the moment or settling in debt, and fishermen are share fishermen. If the boat settles in debt, they don't get paid and they've already lost crew. So we need to fix this issue. Ultimately, decarbonising the industry is the solution that we need to get to over time, and the Fisheries Fund will hopefully get us there. People have been using the FAS funding for new technologies on their boats, including like hydrogen injections. So that's been really, really useful, and the FAS fund is very easily accessible. But there's things like small-scale mobile gear vessels don't get the same funding rate as small-scale static gear vessels, even though the mobile gear vessels use more fuel and need more help. Also, things like the cost of materials has increased by at least 50%, and there's things coming over the horizon, like remote electronic monitoring that the industry might have to pay for, and extended producer responsibility for the cost of recycling. So there's more and more costs coming forward from the industry an industry that's not making very much, if any, profit at all right now.
When we were members of the European Union, there were quite strict controls on how funding could be allocated. For example, gear and equipment that was mandatory couldn't be funded unless you could get a little workaround in some cases. So, what have been the experiences of businesses within your fish producers area in actually accessing the seafood funds so far? I mean, have they found it easy? Have they been successful? Is money coming through?
Money is coming through, and it's coming through for additions to their engines that might help with fuel efficiency. The last round of the FAS we used for gear trials, like trialling the Sunwing technology, which we achieved 40% reduction in fuel. So that was really good, but this new round of FAS, you can't use it to get new gear, even if that new gear is more sustainable or more fuel efficient. So that's something that needs to be looked at, because a Sunwing beam trawl, it uses a wing-like technology to create lift, lifts it off the seabed, so there's less seabed impact and less fuel used. But it is much more expensive than a standard beam trawl. So if we could get that through the FAS and hopefully switch the whole beam trawl fleet over to that kind of gear, that'd be really useful.
That'd be a win-win. You're benefiting the fishermen and benefiting the environment, particularly on the seabed. Dr. Stewart, what's your sort of initial reaction to the way this scheme's rolling out and your take on it?
Sure, yeah, I mean, the scheme is very welcome. So it's funded a lot of fantastic projects, both through the Seafood Innovation Fund and through the Fishing Industry Science Partnerships, which I guess are the two elements that I'm sort of most probably knowledgeable about and interested in. I guess we'll come on to some of the details a bit later about, pros and cons and things like that. But yeah, I mean, there's some fantastic innovations. So, I'm involved in the one that's the so-called scallop discos, so potting with lights to catch scallops, which has the potential, still a potential to provide a more sustainable approach to scallop fishing with lower impact on the environment. We also have some fantastic examples with fishermen and scientists working together through the FISP. And some of those are directed towards things like reducing bycatch or particularly gathering more data on data-limited species, so a lot of the shellfish, non-quota species. And I think that's, when I look at this overall, that's where the fund has to really deliver. So to bring in much more data on both those species and also those habitats, because we really live in an era of uncertainty, right? We've heard about some of the challenges the fishing industry face. We've also got, obviously, Brexit not delivering everything that was probably hoped for, to put it mildly. We have uncertainty.
Tomorrow, I think, is jam tomorrow, I think, is what the fishermen
well,
tell me.
I don't think there will be any, to be fair. And so trading's become more complicated. We've also got things like climate change going on, shifting the distribution of fish stocks. Some are moving away, but some new opportunities are coming in as well. And so we really need to monitor the environment as well as possible to be able to be sort of nimble enough to take advantage of those things, but also not, over-exploit. And I guess that's where I'd bring in my note of caution is, one of the things that these sorts of funds can do is encourage overcapacity. So we've just had the World Trade Organization, this historic agreement after 20-odd years of negotiations to try and phase out harmful fisheries subsidies. But exactly what they are is a fine line. And, there's a lot of scientists who say that subsidising fuel is a harmful fishing subsidy. And yet I'm sure Chloe's members and many others in the fishing industry would say they can't survive without that. And so we've got to get that balance right. And I think that's where we'll have to wait and see, really, and keep an eye on the ball with this fund.
I don't think it was ever envisaged that this fund would be a fuel subsidy. I mean, we can ask the Minister later on if she's looking at that, but that's not something that was ever I was aware of.
No, I guess that's not what I'm suggesting, but, you make fishing boats even more and more efficient. There is always that danger of having boats with sort of, higher turnover, that therefore that puts more pressure on stocks. Ultimately, the way to reduce pressure on the environment is to have really healthy marine environment with healthy fish stocks that you don't need to fish so hard. So, there's an example of scallop fisheries off the coast of France where they only fish 45 minutes a day because the stocks are so healthy, that's all they need to do. And so that's a lower environmental footprint, it's a lower fuel cost, everyone's a winner, basically. So that's really the end goal.
Thank you. Certainly more sustainable scalping will be music to the ears of the static gear guys off the Yorkshire coast who get the nomadic fleet arriving and not only smashing up lots of crab and lobster, but often hauling away whole fleets of pots and causing carnage. But Helen, obviously talking about sustainability in the environment, something RSPB will be very conscious of. Do you feel that the way this scheme is being delivered it's being delivered in a way that you would think benefits bird life and your members' wishes, or?
Well, I think we have to look at the backdrop on which it's operating, and Bryce sort of commented there on it. The fact is we do have both a climate and a nature crisis. So our biodiversity is in decline and climate challenges are on the increase. And so it's incumbent on every sector, not just the fisheries sector, but across civil society, to look at what we can be doing to address both of those challenges. And I think while one of the objectives of the fund was to state it as to enable a sustainable fishing industry, there isn't really anything explicitly in there and encouraging for purposes of addressing both of those. So, I mean, Chloe's touched upon it, certainly, you know, that decarbonisation agenda, that needs big infrastructure sort of priorities to be addressed, but done in a joined up way. And I think that's something which we really need to think about, how the fund and the work that the work that it supports actually meets policy priorities and interventions. So you talked about, you know, how does it help seabirds? RSPB were actually a recipient of an early part of the funding in 2020 to look at, you know, the bycatch of seabirds. There are thousands of seabirds caught in UK fisheries each year.
That with long lining, is that?
Yeah. Long lining is one of the key fisheries, and it was that fishery that we were looking at. And they did a bit of exploratory work to find out what the problem was, found that the sinking rate of the lines was slower than other fisheries. And so the mitigation that you would like to trial we could actually go on and develop that. But the next phase was not put together, not because of a failure of the fund, but possibly of the enabling circumstances. So not an awful lot of support from government to take that forward, or from the fleet, who by that time were a bit reluctant. So, and yet we have a backdrop of good environmental status, which is 15 indicators of ocean health, and we're failing to meet 11 of them. And seabirds is not only failing, but it's moving further away from the indicators. So, you know, we have that policy of we want to do something for seabirds. They're under increasing stress and pressure, but this is not really helping it. And it's a solvable problem in fisheries. So thinking about things like that. And I would say, and finally, just looking at the sustainability of our stocks. Bryce mentioned that. I mean, about 60% of the stocks that are commercially fished either have very poor or no data. And so with no data are at risk of overfishing, and we've got 35% of the stocks, only 35%.
We're going to move on to that in a later question, actually. So
okay,
thanks.
We can pick that up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thanks very much, Chair. You've all sort of touched on this, but DEFRA have said that the three primary components, the science and innovation, the infrastructure and the skills and training, that all of those will help the fishing industry reach environmental sustainability. Do you think that that's the case? Do you agree with them? Or do you think that there should have been a specific overarching or specific individual environmental scheme in relation to this? Dr. Stewart, do you want to start?
My question is,
yeah, so I think definitely all those components have the potential to deliver environmental sustainability. So I don't think there necessarily has to be a separate stream, because this has been the whole problem, like with fisheries management since it's existed. You know, we've had the fishing industry and we've had the environmental sector. And you know, look at the EU; they have two completely different directorates, and it doesn't work. We need to be moving towards ecosystem-based fisheries management, and included in that are the people, the fishermen as well. You know, we're all and the scientists. Like, we're all part of the ecosystem that connects to the ocean. So I think the scheme, as it stands, definitely has the potential, but I think it's really important that, and it's great this inquiry is happening, that after the first year or so that we're looking at it and seeing what it's delivered and where the gaps are and where it can move forward in the future. And, you know, I can talk about some of those gaps a bit later on. But, so I don't think there's anything wrong with the structure as such. It's just we've got to keep our eye on the ball.
So just to follow up on that, if you had a magic wand and you could edit the scheme in any way, you know, either massively or a little bit, in order to increase the likelihood that it will get good outcomes for environmental sustainability, what would you do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, you know, I'm going to say this as a scientist, but one of the biggest issues that we all face is the length of funding schemes. You know, most of the stuff that I work on, it's 2 or 3 years. You might do some fantastic work, and then you've got to start again, and you've got to justify, you know, which is a huge amount of work. I mean, I think the average success of a funding bid at university is sort of 10 or 15%. So that means waste a huge amount of time. That is not productive for anyone. So, you know, building on existing successes is really important. So if you know, a program of data collection, a partnership between the industry and scientists, or an innovative bit of technology has really delivered, then you've got to keep backing that. And then, yeah, the other thing really that and again I can come into more details later, but is sort of missing so far is more focus on the actual like ecosystem. So it's mostly about, yes, there's some good stuff on bycatch, and yes, there's a lot about fisheries, there's a lot about aquaculture and sort of processing that's been funded. There's almost nothing on monitoring the environment, for example, like the marine protected areas that have been set up, and we're going to see more highly protected marine areas in the future. We've got to monitor those and make sure they're delivering and potentially adapt them if they're not. Again, otherwise, what are we doing, basically? And so far, the scheme hasn't really delivered in that department. So I think there's definitely opportunities.
Thanks. Helen McLaughlin, in terms of the questions that I asked about, should there be a separate environmental scheme? And if you had a magic wand in order to fix this, what would you do, please?
Thanks. I think Bryce is right that certainly the areas identified within the fund can all address environmental issues. But I think perhaps it could do with some identifying some of the key gaps, perhaps, that we already know about, because I think we do know some of the key gaps. So Bryce mentioned effective monitoring of the impact of MPAs, for example. When you look at the European Maritime Fisheries and Aquaculture Fund, which has just started a new funding round, they talk about specifics of innovation in the sustainable blue economy. They talk about, the economic and social vitality of coastal communities, sustainable and competitive low carbon fishing, none of which are really identified in this call. My magic wand, one of the key things that we need in all of this is data. And it was something which I think that you heard from when you took evidence from the industry earlier in the month. Barry Dees said, data is absolutely crucial in order to support effective
coming on to
management.
that, with Neil Hudson's going to ask specifically about data, so that's great. Get a particular question.
Thanks.
Did you want to add anything to?
Yes, sure. I agree that the structure of the fund does. The infrastructure part you have to have a sustainability, section of it, and the FISP is all about data. I think that the FISP lacks a view on socioeconomic data, which can feed into things like wind farms and displacement. You're displacing fishing effort, but you're not reducing fishing effort. And we don't monitor at all the areas that the fishing effort is displaced to. You're increasing it in other areas. And so we had got quite far down with creating a project with 3 universities looking at the biological and socioeconomic impact of displacement. And it wasn't in the scope of the FISP fund. So we couldn't go ahead with that.
Well, that's really helpful. Thanks very much, Chair.
Geraint Davies.
Yeah, so leading on directly from that, I was going to ask whether you felt the 100 million fund overall is big enough, but secondly, as we've just been talking about, what specific projects you'd like to see backed to have the biggest impact on the environment. So, maybe Chloe, we could start with you. Are you basically saying that some of that 100 million should be looking at the displacement of fishing from where there's wind farms to over-intensive fishing elsewhere, and what should be done about that?
Definitely, I think displacement is another huge challenge that the industry is facing and is only going to get worse. I also think The infrastructure fund in Brixham, we're trying to expand the port because it's actually quite dangerous, the amount of boats that are having to fit in a small space. But we couldn't use the infrastructure fund for that. We had to go for the levelling up fund because of the size of the projects in the infrastructure fund was too small. Also, as Bryce mentioned, it's the length of time for FISP. Most fisheries data requires a time series, and FISP doesn't give that. So it's sort of short little bits of science projects, but not any sort of time series of science projects that we're getting out of it.
So I'm clear here. Are you saying, if we're interested in sustainable fishing, are you saying that the impact of a large number of wind farms will be basically to reduce fishing in one area, then massively increase it in another area, and therefore create sort of pockets of unsustainability alongside other areas which aren't fished?
There's a potential for that, yes, but there's also things to consider, like you're making people go further away to find a fishing ground than their optimal fishing ground, potentially, if you place the wind farm there, which means more fuel burnt. So there's a lot of knock-on effects that don't get considered.
And Dr. Stewart, do you feel that the 100 million is enough, and where should we be focusing our fire in terms of environmental projects? And given what you said earlier about money running out, would it be better to have sort of possibly fewer projects running for longer rather than more projects for a short amount of time where they can't mature into benefit?
I think, I mean, what we want is another fisheries fund when this one stops, basically. That's the simple answer. It's risky to just back, fewer projects. I think one thing that the fund does quite well is has two tiers. So it has a pilot phase for some projects that then can move into bigger ones, and that's a really good way forward.
Projects. What projects would you focus on? Yeah,
so I mean, I've talked a little bit about sort of habitat mapping and marine protected areas and things like that. One thing that I don't think the Seafood Fund has covered at all is recreational fisheries so far. So recreational fishing, depending on how you look at the statistics, there's 800,000 regular anglers in the UK. Again, you can say it's potentially worth even more than commercial fishing when you put all the add-on sort of value. That's a very sort of key sector in terms of both socio-economics, but also mental health, well-being. A lot of people get a huge amount of sort of benefits, both mental and physical health. But also anglers are, they've got their eyes on the water, basically. So they're a sort of untapped resource for collecting data. And so I think that's something that we could really take advantage of. There are some projects out there at the moment, like the Sea Angling Diary run by CFAS, but it seems to be only reaching certain sectors. But, there's other things that anglers can do. For example, reporting on megafauna like whales and dolphins and seabirds and sunfish and basking sharks and all these sorts of things that they see out at sea. And I think there's a lot of potential to sort of support that industry more, both to give something to it, so to provide more infrastructure. I come from Australia. We love our recreational fishing over there. There are certain areas that are purely dedicated to recreational fishing. They have excellent facilities on land, boat ramps, toilets, fish cleaning sites, etc., etc. But also, using the angling sector as basically citizen scientists as well to fill some of these information gaps. So there's definitely a lot of potential there. I talked about marine protected areas, habitat mapping, and of course, all of this goes together with monitoring the effects of climate change, and that clearly is something that needs long-term data sets to really get a handle on.
Right, so if we want to sort of sit alongside the fishing and seafood scheme as well, is one of the things you're saying that we should embrace the opportunities as well in the round of recreational fishing to bring people close to the environment, and to bring in tourism, to help the economy,
exactly.
and to bring, have more empathy, if you like, with the sea world, and provide more support for more funding. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, I was an angler myself from the age of 3. That's half the reason I'm here today, basically, because my parents took me down the coast, and when I was 5 years old, I told my dad I wanted to be a professional holiday man so I could live at the beach all day, and he said, you should become a marine biologist instead.
Oh, yeah.
And here I am. Not at the beach, but it's still fascinating. So, there's a lot of potential there, absolutely. So we should not forget about it.
All right, Helen, finally you, in terms of the size of the fund and the breadth and the focus, what sort of projects would you like to see the focus of the 100 million being, and is it enough?
Well, so first of all, I think the size of the fund in comparison to the sort of money we were getting through EMFF is sort of about half at the minute, and of course the way that it's being distributed is not similar to the way that we did it under EMFF, whereby it was allocated to different countries, sort of broadly reflecting the fleets. As I said previously, so if we're going to address the climate and nature challenges facing us, the emergencies that we're facing, data is going to be key. We need to have sustainable management of the stocks that we're fishing, and data will be absolutely key for that. In terms of addressing the climate impacts, decarbonisation is going to be fundamental, as it will be for all maritime users. So looking at how we invest in that decarbonisation, supporting fleets to move away from fossil fuel use will be really important strategically. How do we do that from innovation at the minute to off the shelf being a real option for vessels? And the data collection, we really think that needs to be something that's quite sort of across the fleets. So the use of remote electronic monitoring with cameras, it's something which, the seafood industries have been calling for. It was identified as a key compliance issue by the House of Lords in their inquiry into landing obligation. And it was cited as the key tool that would really start to move our fisheries management towards a more sustainable future. So those would be two of the big pieces that we would look to prioritise.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Just following on from that, we talked about wind farms. I mean, I was always led to believe that when I was at DEFRA that you're in effect creating a spawning ground for fish, that you can't fish between the turbines, and therefore that would actually help stocks build. Is there any evidence that that's happening, or is that just another justification for building them?
No, I think you're right to bring that up, because there are pros and cons to wind farms. Clearly, the big pro is the fact that they're reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. Now, so even if they do have some impacts on the environment, on the fishing industry, they're a necessary way forward. The UK is, one of the best places in the world, if not the best, for wind power. So what you've got to do is try and find ways to build them and to operate within them that sort of provides as many joint benefits as possible. And there is good evidence that they do provide extra shelter around the bases, the rock foundations, provide extra settlement habitat in areas that didn't normally have boulders, for example. So again, work done up on the Yorkshire coast by the Hodderness Inshore Fisheries Group has shown actually very little, if not a positive impact of wind farms on their crab and lobster catchers. And then again, they like you say, they provide conservation benefits. So that sector of the fishing industry is probably benefiting other sectors. Then you've got displacement issues. So you've got to try and get.
We've already heard from Chloe the problems. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the North Sea, most of the wind farms are fixed, but now we have floating wind farm technology, and you can't fish within a floating wind farm. There's cables everywhere, and also you can't bury the cables. So the electromagnetic field around the cables, we don't know the impact of that yet. The issues are changing as the technology changes.
We could, of course, build the turbines on land, but then you get all sorts of people objecting about it.
Yeah, but we have it in Wales, of course, because we're more advanced there, so maybe we will see it on land.
Wales are more advanced, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being before us today. I wanted to get on to sort of science and sustainability, so I'm going to come to you first. Dr. Stewart, you are in academia. You've exchanged the fishing off the beaches of Australia for the halls of academia in the UK. So I wanted to ask you about perceptions about academia and science. That DEFRA have actually said that there is a high degree of scepticism amongst fishing communities and fishers about the use of science for fishing. Do you recognise that? Is there a disconnect between science and academia on the one hand and the fishing industry on the other?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we published a study on this a couple of years ago. We put ourselves out there as well. We worked with a very clever former student who had a psychology degree and looked at levels of trust that the fishing industry had in all the different management bodies and scientific bodies across the UK and NGOs and academics. And overall it was low, not surprisingly. I think CFAS were the only ones who passed just. But the real feature of it was the amount of variation. And that was found both certainly with how much they trusted academics, the different responses, and NGOs as well. And that absolutely ties with my own experience. So, you know, I've been lucky enough to work with the fishing industry quite extensively, originally in the Isle of Man when I first came to the British Isles, and then up on Scotland. And I have some, you know, I have friends in the fishing industry and we work very well. I couldn't do what I do without them. The recreational fishing industry as well, they have a lot of distrust in scientists and managers. But if you put in the time, you can build those relationships, but not across the board. So there's also, you know, probably some fishermen may see this or hear about it, who don't like me very much, who don't like what I have to say. And, you know, I guess that's a feature of life. But I think in fishing, it's because it's really difficult to balance the needs of all the different sectors. And, you know, you support one and you're probably not going to be delivering the best sort of outcome for another. So that, yeah, there's a huge issue here. The FISP is doing a great job of delivering against that. But one of the things, because I looked through all the FISP projects, like I know all the scientists involved, it's a small world, and almost all of those projects are built on existing relationships that they have. And so I think this is where, whether it's through this fund or in another way, you know, the government could do a lot of good by sort of providing opportunities for the fishing industry and scientists to work together. We had a couple of years ago a conference called The Future of Inshore Fisheries that was in London, and it was brilliant. You know, 2 days, people all mixed up, they funded fishermen to come, and we just shared ideas, we shared challenges. We got to hear about each other's perspectives. You need time to build those relationships.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And just quickly, Chloe, have you got anything to add there? Do you recognise that disconnect from your side and the communities that you represent?
Yes, I think the fishing industry completely understand the need for data, the need for science to set the quotas. The problem is the quotas are set based on data from 2 years previously because it takes a year to gather last year's data and then you set next year's quotas. So we could try to invest more in more real-time data use.
I'm going to come on to data with the next part of my question, but you do recognise that there is. So you're saying that the organisations that you represent, is there some distrust, or they recognise that the science has to be there and has to be evidence-based, but do you recognise the disconnect at all? There's
a variation in opinion, and there's some things like remote electronic monitoring where some fishermen won't mind at all, and some fishermen have tried it in the past, didn't see the results of it, and so think that there's no point in it.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to data, but I'll go to Helen first to start the data, and then I'll come back to you, Chloe. So, Helen, you started talking earlier about data collection. Do you think that, should data collection to help support stocks and determine fisheries management plans be the focus of the Science and Innovation Scheme?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I absolutely. As I said earlier, we've got a large number of our stocks we have very little or no data for, so we need to fill those gaps in the first instance, and really use that data to feed into the fisheries management modelling, but also when we look at a tool like remote electronic monitoring, as Chloe pointed out, some of the fishermen didn't like it because they didn't get feedback, and these things have got to be done properly, for it to work. So, it involves working in collaboration with the fishermen to get the systems out there to see the real benefits, because we have seen the real benefits where some fishermen in the southwest challenged scientific advice, and we're able to demonstrate their argument by actually having cameras on vessels and looking at near real-time monitoring of what was coming up in the nets. But data is important, not just in terms of getting the stock sustainability in play, but also to look at the true impact of fisheries on non-target marine wildlife. So, coming back to things like seabird and marine mammal bycatch issues, we know very, very little about the true impact of that because we have so little monitoring at sea, real-time monitoring at sea. So that would start to build up that information base, and also look at how we can put out mitigation to try and minimise that and hopefully eliminate in some parts. And those cameras would help with that as well. And then, as I say, that system can help up and down the supply chain in terms of assurances. Consumers are interested in the provenance of their fish, etc., etc. So I do see that as a real key. But as Chloe pointed out, it needs to be done absolutely correctly. You cannot put a camera onto a vessel and then never talk to that fisherman about what's coming up. It has to be an interactive. There needs to be feedback systems. The data has to be looked at. They need to be able to respond. It allows adaptive management in your fishery, as well as providing that massive sort of base of new data and information that can be used.
Thank you, that's really helpful. So it's a two-way process, that the data are collected, then it needs to be fed back, and then evidence-based decisions can be made. Your comments about marine mammals are very timely, that we've launched an inquiry on this committee on marine mammals that we'll be looking at in the autumn, and some of that is the implications on marine mammals from potentially from the fishing sector. So if I come back to you, Chloe, have you got anything to add about sort of data, and then I'll go to Bryce and then end with a final question for all of you about the priorities. But
yeah, I think one of the things that the fishermen don't really understand is the scientific process and the rigidity of it. So CFAS have to do their surveys in exactly the same way, using exactly the same methods in exactly the same places as they did 60 years ago. So the time series is, comparable. But our fishermen fish in different places now because the fish have moved and they've innovated their gear. So they're getting different results than CFAS are getting because of, the gear's totally different. So they don't really understand why the scientists can't adapt to the way that they're fishing, and then they might get similar results. That's
exactly the point the fishermen in Scarborough gave me. In fact, I think they said that CFAS couldn't even catch coals, never mind catch fish, but I think that was maybe a little bit too critical. But it's exactly the criticism that fishermen across the country are obviously levelling.
And things like cuttlefish is a huge fishery down in the southwest. Because of its short-lived lifespan, we need real-time data to manage that fishery, which we haven't invested in yet because it's expensive.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I'm aware of time, Chair, so just finally to the three of you, do you feel that the projects funded so far under the SIF, so the Seafood Innovation Fund, and the FISP, the Fisheries Industry Science Partnerships, do they reflect the announced priorities of the Science and Innovation Scheme? So I guess a quick fire round. Do you think they are reflecting the priorities, Bryce?
Partly. So, with the Seafood Innovation Fund, like I said, it's very much focused on aquaculture and processing at the moment. By my reckoning, There's 94 funded projects, only 12 of them are on fisheries or the environment, mostly on fisheries. The Fishing Industry Science Partnership, yes, it's, there's some great projects in there, almost entirely on shellfish or bycatch. But there's some good signs, like some of them are focused on delivering the fisheries management plans, for example, which is really needed. But we're totally lacking some of the stuff I talked about before, about monitoring environmental impacts.
There's some good stuff in there, but it could be broader.
It needs to be broader,
okay.
and it needs to shift from where it's been.
Okay, that's basically a helpful recommendation for us.
Yeah.
Chloe and Helen, have you got anything to add on that in terms of, is it reflecting the priorities?
Well, we have a blue carbon project that we've applied for the FIS, but we've had to cut it down in size because of the size of the projects that we can apply for. And the Innovation Fund, we're planning to apply in the next round of the Innovation Fund for a gear trial, and those things can also be quite expensive because you have to charter the vessel for a decent amount of time to properly do the trial, and hopefully it will be successful. So we're hoping that will be within the scope of the next round.
Thank you. And just finally, Helen, just quickly, have you got anything to add on that? If you don't, if you agree with everything that's been said, then we can move on, but it's up to you.
I was going to say very, very briefly, I think it would be useful to review previous schemes which have actually gone into operation. Things that have been trialled, thought to be good, and then gone into widespread operation. I think that's something that is possibly missing. And again, looking at the policy priorities that governments are committed to, and how well does the money that is being used here actually support that. And I think transparency is a real key issue in terms of how the money is divided and allocated.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Neil. Julian, I think you're going to ask about the future.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So, the infrastructure scheme, what should be the focus of the infrastructure scheme's second round? I mean, there's some of it's already been touched on. But also, just to sort of combine, because we need to, I think, Chair, we need to move things forward. So, what also could you answer what the lessons learned from the first round of funding scheme that can be drawn into that potential second round scheme? So maybe Chloe to start off with.
The first round of the infrastructure scheme didn't cover fishing vessels or anything to do with decarbonisation of them. So I think that needs to be absolutely key in the second round. A lot of other EU countries do provide some funding for new build vessels. I know this is a thorny issue when it comes to funding because some people think that it could increase capacity, but there's other ways that you can manage that through quotas, and when we have the fishery management plans, hopefully all of the shellfish and non-quota species will be under proper management as well. So we're buying second-hand vessels from Europe. One of my members just bought a vessel that was built in the 80s, and it uses tons of fuel. And also our regulations, which hopefully we can sort out in the fishery management plan, encourage people to build shorter vessels to get around vessel length regulations. So they're shorter, they're wider, which we know is a very fuel inefficient shape of vessels.
And stability issues as well.
And stability issues. Yeah. So we need to build new vessels that have space for new technologies to come in, add blue, different kinds of fuels that can be put in those vessels, and they're built with that in mind. Otherwise, we're just wasting money patching up old vessels.
Okay, that's some really good stuff there. Dr. Stewart?
Yeah, I mean, I would back up a lot of what Chloe's just said. I think definitely, obviously we need to decarbonise like the whole world does, basically. Definitely a focus on safety. I think fishing is still the most dangerous peacetime occupation. And I think also sort of a modernisation of the fishing industry as well to attract more people, more local people, and people who I think, I guess I went to the States a few years ago, and, some of the fishing vessels over there, they got Wi-Fi, they got gyms, they got showers, they've got, they attract bright young people who are ambitious, who want to be successful business people. Gone are the days. I've been on some pretty rough fishing boats. I would never want to be a commercial fisherman on those things. Like, it's tough, it's dangerous. We need people who are, smart, who are sort of embracing the latest technology to not only obviously fish efficiently, safely, but also keep in mind environmental sustainability as well. So all of those things.
It's about modernisation of the
Absolutely.
fleet, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. Very quickly, Helen, is there anything you feel DEFRA could do to increase the account taken for environmental considerations when the second round of infrastructure schemes, the funding scheme, comes forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I mentioned at the top of the session, good environmental status, turning those red and amber indicators to green. I mean, that's where we need to get to, and being clear about what the gaps are in the ability to do that across the piece would be really helpful, because there are key gaps in our knowledge around features such as what are really critical habitats for certain species, what are the impacts of what are diet compositions of some of our top predators and temporal changes. So funding in the right place for the right bits of research to support the shift towards good environmental status, but also, as Bryce and Chloe said, the decarbonisation agenda is absolutely fundamental that we get that right, and a key barrier is port infrastructure, charging points, getting vessels and that are not that we shift those vessels away from fossil fuel use towards electrification and other methods.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And final question, you'll be pleased to hear. Actually, we're doing really well for time. Derek Thomas from the Southwest.
Yes. Hello, how are you? So I'm quite familiar with the CFPO, which I'm sure you are, Chloe. But Chloe, my question is directed at you. So the Seafood Fund, how does that compare to funds that EU competitors are receiving? Is it a fair playing sea?
Well, at the moment, some EU countries do get fuel subsidies for the fuel crisis, and we've been told by DEFRA that that's not an option with us, but it does mean that we can't really increase the price of our fish that we're selling, because the French are selling it at a lower price because they're getting a fuel subsidy. So it is important to make sure that we remain competitive against our EU counterparts.
Is it just the help with fuel that is making it less competitive for our fishermen?
I think right now, in this very moment, their fuel subsidies won't last forever. It's a short-term, sticking plaster. But they do get subsidies for new boats. Denmark gets 50% funding rate for a new vessel. Belgium gives 100 million for a new vessel, and Holland gives 500,000. So they all have a lot more modern vessels than we do, and then we buy their old vessels when they're done with them.
Yeah. And is that money targeted specifically at vessels that are fishing in UK waters? Do you get that impression?
Yes, a lot of their fishing is in UK waters, yeah.
Okay. So the Seafood Fund, at the moment, I understand it's there for the whole of the fleet across UK waters to get hold of if they can. Do you think that it should, rather than do it that way, it should have been distributed to the 4 nations and then distributed that way? Have you got a view on that?
So distributing the Seafood Fund 4 ways first, and then each nation decides.
Yeah.
I don't know, actually. I haven't thought about that one.
No, that's fine. It's so the last question, you've got the Minister right behind you, so this will be interesting. How will you measure the fund as having been, the Seafood Fund as having been successful? So what would your advice, if you were in the room with the Minister, be about how you believe the fishing sector will say, yeah, that was a success, that was money well spent, that's done the job?
Are people feeling positive about the industry? Some ports you go to and you talk to the fishermen, and there are all negative feelings. In Brixham, it was the other way around. There's a lot of positive feeling, a lot of investment. We're trying to expand the port. Right now, it's switched because of the fuel crisis, but are people investing in the industry? Can we say for definite that all the fish stocks are in a healthy place? Those two things are key.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Chair. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Yes, I mean, I think probably the other two witnesses maybe follow up on that question of what you would see as being a measure of success of this £100 million. It's quite a lot of money going into the industry. You know, will it stick to the sides, or is it just going to flow through, basically?
I mean, yeah, so overall, all the things we've sort of heard about, Helen's talked about the ecosystem indicators and this is, the sort of mixed bag on sustainability of stocks. We want to see all those things going up. We want to see a more modern fishing fleet, more modern fishing industry with safer and lower sort of environmental and carbon footprints. I think from the perspective of the fund itself, we want to actually see the projects that it's funded being used. The technology that it's been funded, whether or not it's lights to reduce bycatch or or lights to increase scallop catches or whatever it is, we want to actually see that, those haven't just been good ideas that got funded for a couple of years and then they got forgotten about, that they've actually been adopted, but also that they've been managed as well. So, you can fund some fantastic innovations that make things really efficient, but if you don't manage those, you might have unintended consequences, and anyone who works in fisheries knows that it's full of them. You fix one thing and you cause another problem over here. So I think all of those things, but also coming back to the question about trust, I think a better relationship between the fishing industry, scientists, managers and the government, I think wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? We're all working for the same end goal: healthy seas, productive fishing industry, reduce climate impact, lots of lovely seafood on our plates. It's all good.
Fantastic. Helen, have you a final point on that? What does success look like? I presume more seabirds would be your answer in short.
Well, absolutely, more seabirds moving, up towards being in a better place and reducing bycatch. Sorting out their feed, a sand eel ban across the UK, EEZ at this point in time would be a win-win. But taking it back, we did pass the Fisheries Act and it has some very good objectives. And if we were to achieve those objectives of sustainability, ecosystem management, climate change, both mitigation and modification, and the bycatch objective, to my mind, that would be a success. And if we're able to step back and say, as Bryce said, flourishing coastal communities operating in a healthy seas so that we have a broad range of seafood available to us, but not at the expense of other marine wildlife. And the one key thing that we think would really underpin a lot of those objectives and meeting them would be the adoption of remote electronic monitoring with cameras, because it will start to evidence it, it will hit the supply chain up, from consumer through to catcher, and we think that would be a really wise investment of money.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thanks to our two witnesses in the room as well. It's been a very useful session, and we're now going to hear from the Minister, so we'll just quickly change over to the Minister and one of her officials.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Indeed. The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, and welcome back to the EFRA Select Committee. I'm Robert Goodall, the chair of the committee, and we're very pleased to be joined by the Minister, Victoria Prentice, and Sarah Adcock, who I remember from when I was doing Victoria's job.
So, remembers you too, Sir Robert.
What's your title now, Sarah, just for the...
I am Deputy Director of Evidence, Funding and Ocean Sustainability Strategy.
Fantastic. Now, I think, Victoria, you're going to have an opening statement, which I think you're hoping will head off all the difficult questions, but I suspect it may not.
It's not so much a statement as I'm trying to be helpful, Sir Robert, because our funds are many and complex, and I thought, actually, it might make life easier if I did a bit of a slide pack for you. So, I mean, if it would help you, I'll talk you through it quickly.
Yes, please. Bearing in mind, people watching on TV won't have the benefit of the slide pack.
Yes,
So
okay. Well, the first page is about the UK Seafood Fund, which is what I believe we're here to discuss. Giving the objective, it's to revitalise the seafood industry so it has the capability to land, process and bring to market a larger share of quota, while also supporting the industry to become more self-sustaining. And you'll see beneath that are 4 blocks. So science and innovation, 24 million. Infrastructure, at least 65 million. Reform and modernise infrastructure.
When you say at least, do you mean there could be more money to come, or they'll pinch from the others?
It would. We would anticipate that it would be pinching from the others. The one thing I should say at this point, though, is that though this is a £100 million fund, much of it is match funding, so we would expect significantly more investment to flow from this one fund, if you see what I mean.
Understood.
Skills and training up to 10 million, encourage new entrants to the industry and upskill the existing workforce. Export promotion 100 million, boosting our seafood exports to both new and existing markets. So that just gives you a picture. So when we start talking about the science and innovation block, you know what we mean. So on the infrastructure scheme, round 1, I think there's quite a useful pie chart. So we've recently closed round 1 on the 14th of June. We did lots of engagement beforehand. We had webinars, we had meetings, we met the larger POs individually. We talked to lots of fishermen across the piece, really. These efforts resulted in 33, if I may say so, cracking applications. We're really pleased with the quality of application, which request, if you add them up, over £60 million worth of government funding, and because of the match funding element, worth over 220 million altogether. I'm not saying all of them will succeed, because clearly you've seen our budget on the previous slide, but that gives you some idea of the quality of the applications that we've had so far.
When that happens, are you going to reduce the amount for each project? Are you going to select the projects that are the best and then fund those fully?
We have a really well-worked set of metrics. It will vary from project to project. There aren't millions of these. These are large infrastructure projects. There are 33 applications, so it will have to be done very much on a case-by-case basis, if I'm honest.
And I think some of the ports didn't put an application in because the timescale for completion was too ambitious. But then when you extended the timescale, you didn't reopen it again. I mean, they feel a little bit miffed. Will they be able to apply on the
yes,
next one?
they will be able to reapply in a future round, and that is why we must keep some of the money back to ensure that they are not disadvantaged.
So if I could just come in there, we actually we did talk to stakeholders about whether or not we just extended round 1 to following the extension to the end of 25 deadline. But actually the stakeholder feedback we got was that a lot of projects that had submitted a bid for round 1 were ready to deliver by a March 2024 deadline and didn't want that delay in their project starting. So based on stakeholder feedback, we are going to open a second round of large infrastructure projects in about September with a March 25 deadline. And we sort of already signalled we were going to do that anyway, because you'll have noticed on here that Northern Ireland did not bid in this round, because we had indicated there would be a second round, largely because of We were, again, stakeholder feedback says they might have difficulty putting applications in because of the Ukraine crisis. So we'd signalled there was going to be a second round. We are honouring that signal, but we are doing that now with a March 25 deadline. And we've contacted everybody.
But those who had already put in wanted us to reply to their bids, which we're doing by the 7th of September. And they will then know how they got on. And I think it's right that we listen to them as well. These are substantial bids for often changes to port structures. They will require things like planning permission, and they aren't the sort of project that can be built in a matter of weeks. So
it's not just a few porter cabins on the dockside, basically.
I completely sympathise with why both the application process has been more complicated for some, and also why others have wanted to get it over and done with quickly.
Okay. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, it's absolutely fine.
We're mopping up one to the question I was going to ask as they come appropriate.
So these are major infrastructure, multiple benefits, transformational improvements to ports, harbours and processing, for example. So we then go on to the next slide, which actually answers a lot of what we were just talking about, infrastructure next steps. We'll launch future rounds. We'll also have a round for the catching sector. And there are some ideas given on this slide as to the sort of things that we might fund, not conclusive, for the catching sector, provided to the smaller boats, no more than 10 grand each, incentivising a reduction in carbon emissions complementary to existing schemes, for example. That is not written in stone or...
Not fuel subsidies, as we heard from fishermen in the southwest.
Would you like to talk about fuel now or later?
Well... it was touched on. I don't think it's one of the things we were going to ask about because it only came up in the first evidence session. So if you'd like to just talk about that, I mean...
Yes, very happy to talk about fuel. We clearly fuel for us all. I mean, anybody who's filled the car, let alone the vessel, knows that fuel costs have gone up across the board because of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. What we don't know, of course, is how long that situation is going to last or what is going to happen to fuel costs in the meantime. So the fishing sector is unusual compared with other sectors in various ways, but one is that they are heavily fuel is a major cost of each trip, as you know, Sir Robert. So it's a very significant part of a fisherman's budget, much more so than in the case of most industries. And because of that, it means that fishing is one of the very few sectors to benefit from duty relief on fuel. So there are two different types of duty relief. One is the marine voyagers relief, and the other is the extension of red diesel, which the Chancellor was pleased to give us in this year's budget for the fishing sector. So that, taken in combination, that should add up to 100% of relief on fuel duty costs for fishing. We are not minded to pay fishermen's fuel bills apart from the relief that they've been given.
Okay, understood. Back to your
back to my slides. Science and innovation.
Can I just ask on that so we understand that? So if I was a fisherman, how much would, obviously taking the duty off, but the price has gone up, so how much would my cost of energy go up? So
well, it completely depends on the cost of diesel. What you are buffeted from is the tax cost.
The percentage cost, I mean, in terms of...
How much has diesel gone up?
Yeah, because you're taking off the duty, but they still face... the price goes up, the duty goes down, so how much is the net increase?
It's very variable at the moment, isn't it?
Yes, across the UK, we've got price of diesel ranges from about... I think it's 99 pence a litre currently in Peterhead to something like £1.34 in Wales.
Yes.
I was quoted 1.14 plus that, but obviously one gets the VAT back. All my tanks are empty on my farm. I'm waiting for the price to come down. In vain, I suspect. But it is a major cost, and because the problem is if the fisherman goes out and has an unsuccessful voyage for whatever reason, he can end up actually losing money on the trip, which is...
Yes, and fuel costs, as you all know, have always been a major part of the equation for fishermen. Is it worth me making this trip?
All right, I'll leave it there because we don't know.
I mean, obviously, the EU boats, some of them are getting fuel subsidies, we understand. Does that put us at a competitive disadvantage to them?
Well, we understand that some EU countries have made some interventions on the fuel front. What we do have to be careful of is that we don't fall foul of international trading rules. I don't think we could go below the price of fuel. What we've done is remove all the tax. So I think it's quite hard for us to go any further than that. And certainly, you know, if you're seeking to make a food security argument, I think that's quite difficult if you're a vessel that catches only fish that is exported, for example.
Sorry, can I just ask on this? Because my understanding is that in Russia they've now reduced the price of gas and oil for domestic consumption, which would include fishing boats. So is there an issue of Russian vessels coming in, taking, you know, on a much cheaper cost basis, doing a lot of fishing, where, you know, our fishermen and women won't be in a position to viably fish?
We're not permitting Russian vessels, well, to either land or fish in our waters.
They can't land. But
they can't fish either. No. There's no. We are not permitting Russian flagged vessels to fish in our waters nor to land in our ports.
Right.
I only wish the same was true of everyone else.
But there are areas they can fish, and they can more economically fish now because of the crisis we face. That's right, isn't it?
I don't know what is going on in the Russian domestic situation with their subsidy to their fishing fleet.
But their export markets are being closed off, so they cannot export their fish to the UK.
And we've closed off specifically some of their products. We've engaged in a really robust sanctions package, and as we've said before, we're about to increase the tariff on Russian whitefish to a really substantial amount, 35%, which I think means it will not be bought and sold here.
Okay, thank you.
Shall we just trot through the rest of your presentation?
Yeah, sorry.
I think it's been very helpful because we're picking up things as
yes,
we get
exactly.
to them. But,
so science and innovation, we've made £24 million available to fund scientific research, the development of new technologies and ideas. There are two schemes within this, and this is where it really does start to get quite confusing. Seafood Innovation Fund and the Fisheries Industry Science Partnership Scheme. So the second of those supports the fishing and seafood industry to work jointly with scientists to gather new data to manage our fish stocks more sustainably. The first of the funds support projects which develop innovative ideas and technologies. So I've done some pictures there of some examples of innovative technologies. They don't have to be terribly complex, but they can be very effective. So
describe
the scallop disco.
What they are.
Yes, so the one on the left has been described by the media as a scallop disco. It's putting little LED lights to attract scallops into pots. It works very well. It means that other species are not so attracted. You can use an LED light that we know is more attractive to scallops, and it thereby reduces bycatch and makes the pots more efficient. So, do you want to go on?
If I just say two things. One, it was sort of found by accident. That was not the original intention of the sort of original piece of work that led to this project being funded. And second of all, to just pick up on what Dr. Bryce said, your previous witness, the thing that's really exciting about that project, it is now being looked at to see how you can tailor it and make it really, really useful in a commercial perspective so that you can scale it up and actually introduce it. But as was flagged, you have to be really careful in doing that, because what you don't want to do is introduce a new method of catching scallops without taking the old method away, because you'd increase the catching capacity of the fleet, of the stock, and you don't want to do that. So again, you've got to manage that quite carefully, but it's a really exciting project that is being looked at to upscale and commercialise.
Yes, as I said in the first session, the nomadic scallop fleet come up to the Yorkshire coast and just cause mayhem and make a load of money, but it really can be very destructive for the other static gear that's in the area. So thank you. Yes, Neil.
Just a quick, you've probably heard from the previous session and that there is some scepticism amongst the sort of fishing communities about some of the science and the role of academia. And one of our witnesses has suggested that a lot of it has to be sort of communications. Can I just ask, what is DEFRA doing to try to improve that communication, that the science is there, we want the same things, we want to get sustainable fishing, but to communicate that so it's a two-way process as well. What is DEFRA doing to improve that?
Well, actually, I think this isn't a bad example. Right. So, yes, we have the Fisheries Act, yes, we have our overreaching sustainability goals, but they're not possibly very easy things to communicate or very interesting to those of us that are not very, very keen on fishing or sustainability. So this was a really good story. I did a local regional media round about the scallop disco, and it was the sort of story that grasped people's imagination. So I think it is quite important when we talk about science and innovation in both ag and fish, actually, that we bring it very much to people's level and we talk about the practicalities of how it can actually help. And if this means that you catch more scallops more quickly and therefore you don't fish for as long or as hard or upset the marine environment, as Sir Robert was hinting, then that is a good thing. And you can then talk about the sustainability gains at the same time as the fishing gains. Do you want to say any more?
Yep, so under the Fisheries Industry Science Partnerships, it's exactly what you described as what is going on. It is about bringing the fishers and the scientists together. You don't get a project funded if it's not a collaboration between at least one fisher and one scientist, but actually it's open to much more. Yeah. And the general sort of concept behind that was we do have quite a lot of science in the fishing industry. It doesn't often cover everything that we need it to cover, but there is a lot of science. But it's that trust element, not being caught on a vessel that you know somebody who's the skipper of, not being aware of the methodology that was caught, not understanding what fishing season it was caught in. It's all of that, which is what FISP is trying to really kind of get underneath and really properly communicate to the industry that we're doing this science at the times that you would want us to do this science, rather than what is convenient from a commercial vessel point of view.
So you're optimistic that these sort of projects and these schemes are breaking some of the barriers down?
So very much so.
Okay.
And actually, I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to talk about some of them, because I think it is important that we bring science to where people are.
And one further example, is so we've run 2 rounds of the FISP scheme now. The first round, I think we had, I can't remember off the top of my head, but we funded 8 projects. I think we had a couple more. We've been working with, are they called animators? I might have pronounced it incorrectly, forgive me, who are going out to local fishing towns to really kind of explain to fishers how they might come up with their own ideas and then introduce them to scientists to make that sort of partnership. The second round closed, we had significantly larger numbers of bids. So it is working in that way.
Thank you.
Interesting.
My second picture is just about cameras in baskets, so that you don't have to fiddle around with the basket. You can check what is in the basket remotely, which I think all of us would agree is a win.
I was at Weymouth the other week at CFAS Labs, and they'd said they'd put a camera in one of their tanks, and they had recognised that the behaviour of the fish is significantly different than what you expect it to do. So when you used to go to the tank and lift the lid up, the fish would go crazy. Well, actually, and you think they're doing that all the time. They're not. It was the interference of the human that caused the fish to go a bit nuts in the tank, which I thought was really interesting.
Are you saying that you could put a camera in a lobster pot or creel and then only haul it when you've got some lobster?
Something to catch. Yes, absolutely.
Right. That's an interesting one, yeah.
Exactly, and that's again easy to grasp the concept of and the value of very quickly.
Okay, and once these new innovations are developed to the extent they can be rolled out, will there be funding through this fund for them then to be deployed?
Yes, or other funds. I mean, this is very much looking to the future of the industry and sensible changes that we can all make.
Understood. Are we nearly there?
Yes,
Yeah.
we really are nearly there. Skills and training, I'll whiz through up to £10 million for both.
So can I just
sorry,
ask, on the lobsters, is there a danger then if you've got these pots that got cameras in them and you only pull them up if they've got lobsters in them, that you'll just extinguish the whole population of lobsters? I know you're trying to put controls on this, but it does give rise to intensive overkill, doesn't it?
Very good point and very well made. And I think the project that we're actually funding is less at the moment about monitoring, when to pull up your pot, and more about that data collection aspect, so that we can indeed set sustainable management measures for the sustainable fishing of lobster. So it's sort of the step before the point.
Because lobster are non-quota species.
Stocks.
We manage them by carapace size.
Yes.
So if you catch a lobster that's too small, you have to put it back. And there's things like tail notching as well, which help to conserve them. And
we are drastically improving our knowledge of non-quota species. Not in all stocks immediately, but we are working very hard on this because we need to check that we are managing them sustainably.
And will this stop people landing lobsters which have got eggs? So obviously there's the stories of people brushing the eggs off and catching the lobster. There's nothing we can do. Does this help with that or hinder?
Well, if we become concerned about the sustainability of the stock, we can then put management measures in place to ensure that the wrong sorts of lobsters are not caught, or at certain times. But we're a bit of a way off that, truthfully. Sorry.
They're buried hens, aren't they?
Buried hens, yeah.
Yeah. But it's quite a serious offence to actually scrub a lobster, but allegedly it happens.
But again, back to the point that Dr. Hudson made, if you've developed that science and that relationship with the fishers, you're more likely to actually have compliance because they understand what it is, why you're setting what you're setting. So it's again that circle.
Yeah.
And because of the way that we're trying to work very much with the fishing industry in setting local laws and regulations to manage different stocks, we are very much trying to bring people with us.
Okay. Skills and training?
Skills and training, sorry. So both for new entrants and for existing people in the fishing industry to purchase training equipment and to build specialist hubs. We want to improve accessibility of courses. For example, quite a lot of it might be remote, as well as funding portable training, which would itself go to you, as it were, around the UK. The aim is to help educate and attract catching sector workers in the longer term so that people can take advantage of the sustainable opportunities for fishing in the future. So that is quite an ambitious package. And then finally, the seafood exports package, just launched, £1 million to promote UK seafood in both new and existing markets overseas. Funding's being used to achieve the government's general objectives to promote Great British produce around the world. We funded very recently our first ever UK pavilion at the Seafood Expo in Barcelona. So that was a step forward. It went down very well and everybody was very pleased with it. The package is also funding a UK-based seafood specialist who will work with businesses to help them with their export
We've got a question
journey.
about that later on, so we'll come to that.
So the slides were just intended to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of our funding packages at the moment.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think the big question is, obviously, when fishermen were very disappointed they didn't get the fishing opportunities at the point we came to the agreement with the European Union, and that this 5-year transition, that's only moving from sort of access to about a third of the stocks to about half the stocks because of obviously things like zonal attachment, etc. And this scheme was designed, I think, to ensure that we would still have a fishing industry at the end of this process to be able to catch the fish when the sea of opportunity presented itself. Are you confident this is going to actually deliver that?
Yes, I think it's a good scheme. I think it is sufficiently diverse and targeted to make sure that we put the industry in the place it needs to be to benefit from increased quota. And it also, along the way, ought to make some real sustainability and environmental changes so that this is a fully modernised industry with a decent, skilled, trained workforce to do the catching.
A lot of the money so far, at least, has gone into land infrastructure, other ways. It's not actually sort of got onto fishing boats in any great degree. Can we hope that? Because I know the industry were quite critical of their suggestions during the consultation weren't picked up, and it became very infrastructure heavy.
We had to start with the big bits of infrastructure because those take the longest to get planning permission for, to build, to work with local authorities and other partners in delivering. So there will certainly, coming forward in future rounds, be much more of an emphasis on the catching sector in particular. And one of my slides did touch on the plans we've got for smaller boats, for example. Some of that will be to help them with sustainability changes and changes to engines to make them greener, but not restricted to that at all. And as you've seen, I think, Sir Robert, even our science fund ought to be accessible to the sort of person that puts down pots.
Obviously, I said there'll be 50% access to the fish that's there. What are the predictions in terms of quota that will be there in 2026? Is it, obviously, what sort of data have you got? Because obviously you can't catch fish if it's not actually there, and some of the stocks seem to be either moving or declining.
We are doing a very large piece of work on non-quota stocks, which I would be delighted to come and talk to the committee about on another occasion when we're a bit further forward. The data in that area, frankly, had not been very good.
I think we heard in the first session really that fishermen themselves can give you an awful lot of information about what they're catching in real time, and that CFAS is somewhat, because they've got to go to the same place on the same day with the same gear for over a 6-year period. The fishermen take a view that, well, that they're not being flexible like we've had to be. They're not using the latest technology, latest gear. I mean, would you accept that criticism?
I do have a lot of respect for CFAS. I really do. And I think that the information that we're provided with to help us do negotiations on the international stage is genuinely second to none. Having said that, I definitely think that the way forward is to work with local fishermen to find a plan for sustainable fishing in their area. And that's why the whole Fisheries Act is designed to have high level objectives, but to keep getting more and more local in the way that the plans are actually delivered. We are now going around the country starting to make these local plans, and I am sure that that is the way that sustainable fishing will be managed.
Listening to the industry, I think you described
There's
it as.
absolutely no point in doing it without
and
the
do
industry.
the fishermen believe you when you say that?
Well, I think, as you know, Sir Robert, that we have quite a wave to climb, but we're definitely serious about it. We're definitely serious about local management, and I think that is becoming accepted. IFCAs really vary in their listening ability, and where there is good local management, it is noticeable that it works very well.
I think the IFCAs work very well in that regard, actually.
Sorry, Robert. I think it is, and it's also bearing through the UK Seafood Fund. So as we talked earlier, the number of applications from joint partnerships between fishers and scientists is increasing. The number of bids we had under the infrastructure pillar is quite significant. The amount of engagement we're getting under skills and training, where the industry is coming to us to talk to us, has been increasing throughout the life of this. So I think
and with solutions. So I was really pleased with those bids that we got, my pie chart earlier, with the geographical spread. Obviously, Northern Ireland's going to bid later, but I was very pleased with the number of bids from both Scotland and England. And I was also pleased with the different types of bids that came forward. I thought they were really varied and diverse. Okay. And I think that shows that we are getting through.
Thank you. You'll be pleased to know that my next 3 questions were covered during the presentation, but Geraint has a point before I go to Dave.
Just on that particular point you just raised, I noticed there's only 2 bids from Wales out of 33 applications. Obviously, Wales has got quite a large water, front. I mean, does that really cover the waterfront? And are you listening to people of Wales, and what are those bids about?
Do you want to go into details?
Well, I can't give much detail about the bids because it will be fairly obvious where the bids have come from if I give you any detail. So forgive me for not being able to do that. We were really pleased that we had 2 bids from Wales, and actually we think it is economically proportionate, if that makes sense. But of course, Wales can still bid into the future round, so there's no door that's been closed off to them or anything of the sort. What we know is that the 2 places that came to talk to us were the 2 bids that have been put in. So again, back to Minister Prentice's point, we engage and then the bids become fruition rather than we engage and the bids get turned
There
off.
has been really quite considerable engagement with the industry around all 4 nations, actually, before and during the process of bidding. And I think that's a good thing. I don't view that as favouring one bid over another. I would very much encourage anyone who is considering bidding to get in touch with Sarah and her team, who are they've done a formal webinar process for people who are thinking about bidding that anybody can log on to, but also anybody can get in touch. And we really mean it. We're very happy to hold hands through the process.
All right, thanks.
The total pot for infrastructure is £65 million.
Thereabouts.
And you've received bids of about 60 million already. Is that going to mean people being scaled back, or are you going to be much more selective in which schemes?
We obviously won't be able to pay everybody everything they want, right. But we are going to have to look at this on a case-by-case basis. This is a competitive process, and I'm pleased that there are really good quality bids in there.
Because if you cut some of them back, those bids that may not then be viable and they'll fall completely.
We'll be careful not to do that.
So I think it's less likely that we'll cut a bid back, and it's more likely that we're selective about who gets funding in the first place. We've got a very detailed assessment process, a very fair one, because as Minister Prentice mentioned, we don't want anyone to think that England will benefit more favourably than Scotland or Wales, for instance. So it's a very, very thorough process, very clear selection criteria that are available on the website, to which every application will be assessed against. Those selection criteria may get changed for future rounds because they might not be a sensible set of criteria for a catching sector round, for instance. But they are assessed by independent assessors, and then the role of the devolved administrations, they will make sure that the bids that are looking like they're going to get funding haven't been given funding through their own schemes, and then we will make sure that we are being geographically consistent, and awards will be given by the 7th of September.
Understood. Right, we're going to have to make some progress.
Great, I'll be brief. So I'll mention my local harbour, so I declare a bit of an interest, just in terms of context, not for you to comment on the harbour. But Newlyn wanted to apply for the infrastructure fund, but the time it takes to get a harbour provision order ruled them out. And obviously, depending on how you give her the money, that's going to be tricky to achieve anything in Newlyn. Newlyn is the 4th biggest port in terms of landing value, but desperately in need of investment. So have you been able to address this issue of how long it takes to deliver a harbour revision order, or is it actually the case that infrastructure will only be spent where we don't have to get a harbour revision order in place?
I don't know anything about that, but
I do know. What I would suggest is that Newlyn comes and talks to me specifically about their plans, as other areas have done. We are working very, very closely with Dewluck on some of these issues. And indeed, I met with the Minister at Dewluck, who's charged with this, earlier today, and we chatted about 2 projects in particular that are possibles. These are complicated. You know from Newlyn that there'll have to be local authority involvement, there'll have to be GLUC involvement, possibly DEFRA involvement, possibly there's the Shared Prosperity Fund, and there's also the Coastal Communities Fund that are in play. I am very keen that our areas, the coastal areas with fishermen in them, are able to benefit from all of these as appropriate. So if you have a specific set of asks, then for goodness sake,
great.
come and make them.
The point is, and I will do that, thank you, Minister. But the point is that if you have a situation where anything that needs a harbour provision order can't be funded, does it reflect on how poorly the scheme is developed or the lack of ambition for the scheme? And on that basis, now that you've closed the first round, what can you learn from the first round to pitch forward to improve it for the second?
So, in answer to trying to answer both those questions, the first is that we have been engaging with Newlyn in particular, and they were one of the test cases for why we actually sought to extend the scheme to March 25, because we recognised you needed more time in that area. And you are very right to call out that we, as I said earlier, we were looking to open or indeed run round one longer to address the March 25. But actually, it was that, can you learn some lessons? Can you improve the process? Can you make it a little bit easier, etc., etc., all of which we're taking on board before we launch a second round.
Great. So, okay, so I'll find out exactly what's happening in Newlyn. But I still think the harbour provision order means that we can't deliver major investment in the time of the fund, even if it is into 25. So, which sectors...
Is that because of statutory time to
no, not statutory, it just takes forever.
It takes forever.
Yeah, 2 years to get the harbour provision order. And then
well, I think it is worth engaging with us and the Minister from GLUC, because we are genuinely trying to make these schemes as useful and as accessible as possible.
It's really about the time.
And if Shared Prosperity Fund or Coastal Communities Fund funding is useful as well, then we need to make sure that you're fully plugged into those.
Great. I can take that away. I hadn't meant to concentrate on Newlyn. It was just an example of how the fund is so limited when we want to really build a fleet that can sustain all the great opportunities coming our way.
You know, the fund is what it is. It's £100 million. It's a significant investment in our future industry. But clearly we won't be able to fund everything everywhere. But I'm determined to make sure that we access all other pots of funding so that we can make the most of this money.
I think the challenge for all ports is that as time moves on and there's a legislation that requires foreign vessels to land in UK ports, but actually all UK ports want to be ready for that and not to lose that opportunity to
this is why it is quite important, if you go back to my pie chart, that we are putting some real effort into the processing sector as well. We need to make sure that not just the catching sector, but at every point of actually getting the fish to market, we're ready for them.
Great. So that takes me to... sorry, Chair. Second question.
Yes,
might be in the fifth now. Can you confirm which sectors the second round of the infrastructure scheme is going to support? I mean, we've kind of hinted at that there might not be much money in it, but what sectors are going to be included in the second round?
Yeah. So if I can actually cover the second and third rounds. So
okay, right. Yeah,
so
sure.
I wouldn't. We need to assess the £60 million worth of grants under the first round. We cannot make, at this moment in time, we can't make an assumption of whether it'll be 15 million, 10 million, 40 million to get funded. We don't know until we've done the assessment. But the second round, we promised we would do a second round of the same sort of thing we've done now, specifically for the likes of Newlyn and a March 25 deadline and for Northern Ireland. We'd also, we've been talking to the recreational fishers. They will have some access under that. And we're looking specifically at the building of infrastructure for things like training hubs, because again, back to the point we made earlier, that won't come from the the infrastructure money, but it will be part of an infrastructure bid. The third round, as Minister Prentice mentioned earlier, we really do want to put some money into the catching sector itself, into the fleet, into modernising. So the second round infrastructure, bit of the same, some recreational fishers and a bit of training hubs will be September. And then the third round on catching sector, more towards the end of the year, November time.
Right, great. And that takes me to my very last and briefest question. When you move to the fish catching sector, we're talking about much smaller businesses. So what support will DEFRA be able to give to people actually that are fairly small businesses, possibly one-man bands?
Two
women vans.
Two women vans. Two points I'd make on that is that one of the other complaints we've had, or things that have been raised, is that the sort of minimum spend under an infrastructure project would blow an individual business out. Like, they don't have 250,000. To be really clear, the caps that we have put on round 1 are not likely to be the caps for round 3, because each round will be assessed on its merits and the caps set accordingly. The second thing is, again, as Minister Prentice said earlier, we are very happy to talk to anybody and everybody, and the MMO, who are the Marine Management Organisation, have got a really good sort of ask us anything service, and genuinely mean ask us anything. A lot of the catchers, not everyone has ever done a bid before, but they've done bids. You know, some of them have done bids under EMFF money, under EU schemes, but also under our own domestic schemes. So there's a lot of experience and knowledge in that system, but very happy to answer any questions. And again, I really promote the MMO's Ask Us Anything service.
And I suspect we'll be doing webinars again. Yeah. Are you considering bidding? If so, come online for an hour and we'll talk through how to do it.
And we really want to do lots of comms, because I appreciate an individual businessman might miss that bulletin we put out a fortnight ago, or might not look at that website. So it'll be much more on the ground communications to make sure people are aware of the fund. We've been really successful in round 1, and that wasn't a surprise, but it was brilliant. We were very pleased. But talking to the catching sector is very different, and you've got to get to where they are accessing the information, not rely on internet.
And truthfully, if MPs want to be involved in those comms, I would very much welcome that.
Just do alerts on the cat chat. They all have to do that. Chairman, you've been more than patient. Thanks.
No, it's all good questions. Thanks, Derek. Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Chair.
We've got about another 20 minutes or so.
We've talked about some of the overarching aims and sort of mission statements of the funding, but some stakeholders have reported to us that there's been some criticism that there was no specific funding gearing up to look out for the environment and environmental sustainability. So why was that? Do you recognise that criticism, and why was that?
It was baked in, is the simple answer to that.
Baked in at quite a high level.
Baked in to everything we're doing. So I would politely refer those critics to the Fisheries Act objectives, to everything that we're seeking to do in fisheries management terms at a local level, to what we're doing in MPAs and higher protected marine areas, for example. This is a real objective-led stream of work, which I hope is present in every single part of our funding.
Yes. Can I follow up then? If it is baked in, as you say, Minister, for the bids for the Science and Innovation Scheme and the Seafood Fund more generally, if it is baked in, what weight then will be given to the environment when determining whether a bid could be successful?
For the infrastructure fund, all of the assessment criteria are available online, and I would encourage anybody who's interested to have a good look. I've got the ones for the infrastructure fund in front of me, just as it happens. So strengthening the supply chain, I think that can be seen in food security terms and other terms as a sustainable thing to do. Sustainable, of course, does encompass quite a lot of our industry, and we hope all of it in the end. Fisheries health and environmental sustainability is our second heading, as it were. Then social and economic sustainability, which is yet again part of the balance always when funding in fisheries terms. We need to make sure that these coastal communities are sustainable ones. Then project location, to ensure that the funding is going to the most deprived communities. Again, sustainability, though perhaps not environmental sustainability as such. Value for money and efficiency, etc. That very much can be an environmental
And are
issue,
these different criteria equally weighted, or are some more heavily than others?
It depends.
There's a scoring system.
There is a scoring system, but it's been publicly made public in the invitation to tender. Okay. So it's public, different weights for.
Know what you're bidding for.
Exactly.
Yes.
Okay.
And you have to get 50% in any of the topics in order to pass, as it were.
Yeah. Okay, but you're you're comfortable that the criticisms about the environment and sustainability not being looked out
I think they're easy criticisms.
Measured in the
yeah,
criteria.
I think they're very easy criticisms to make.
But when you're
I think when you look at the
process,
details, you will find that they're really not substantiated.
Thank you for that clarification. That's very, very helpful. We've also heard some. I'm sorry to be throwing criticisms out, but this is evidence that we've taken and we throw it back to you.
Right.
The data collection, the querying about the sort of time frame that data are collected.
We've heard that too.
Will the data collection projects be funded over a sufficient time frame to allow a clear picture of the stocks to be established? And if that is the case, can you give us a ballpark of what sort of time frames we might be looking at?
Yes, I can.
So
the first thing to say is that we have got that extension to the UK Seafood Fund to run to March 25. The funding is only for the spending review period. So in answer to your question, will it be sufficient? I would always want time series data that covers 6, 7, 10, 20 years. And I've only got the 3 years to play with. But for the next 2 rounds of the Fisheries Industry Science Partnerships, which are being launched around August and around October, November time, both of those projects will look at bids running to March 25, so more fishing seasons will be covered in that data collection. So, yes, in the limitations of the fact that I've only got this fund for as long as I've got this fund.
Okay. And so when will we know? We won't know until closer to 2025 what the next chapter will be. Then, will we? And that's political. That's government. That's.
Yeah. But I would say that. Look, I'm responsible for the UK Seafood Fund, but it is only one part of the work that we do on data collection. There's a big programme of work under the data collection framework that we still continue doing. So there's still data collected. The bit that we are focusing predominantly on, in particular for Minister Prentice's fisheries management plans, is that non-quota stocks, where we've been really data poor.
Where we do not have the historic data that, frankly, we need and we should have.
Okay. But are you optimistic? Are there sort of mechanisms in place as we get closer to the end of the time frame that you've got, that people will be thinking holistically and biologically and ecologically about, well, we need to be thinking about the next 5-10 years in terms of stocks?
I really
hope so. Are you optimistic those discussions will take place?
And I hope they will be baked into our local fisheries management plans, because it's very hard to manage a fishery without data. And local data and complete data of all stocks, just not the ones that we trade internationally. So I think it is really important. I think data will become increasingly important as we try and manage our fisheries sustainably.
Music to my ears, you're speaking to a vet and a scientist, so the fact that data will be important is more...
I think much more important than it's ever been before.
Okay, I'm going to move now on to my next question, which is on the skills and training, and thank you for your presentation on that. What do you see as the priority areas for the skills and training scheme when assessing application? And in your answer, can you talk about, is the focus going to be supporting new entrants, or is it going to be upskilling existing workers, or a bit of both?
Very much both.
Right.
We need new entrants into our industry. We really do. We need people who are prepared to make this their career and see a future in it. So we'll be improving the quality, these are all stated objectives, and increasing the range of training. We'll be contributing to upskilling knowledge and skills. So, for example, offering qualifications and certificates that help people with their continuing professional development, essentially. And we will also look at the levelling up agenda and make sure that this is genuinely delivered in coastal community, and possibly on a mobile basis geographically. We, the trainer, goes to the fisherman rather than the other way around.
Can I push you on that point in terms of the levelling up agenda and equality of access to these opportunities? We've heard in previous evidence sessions that fishers, when they come back into shore, then perhaps the last thing they're wanting to do is then go off and do their CPD or do further training. Will you be looking at making things a lot more flexible moving forward, so that online learning can be part of it, and so that actually people, when they're coming back to shore, can actually be looked after to make sure that they can upskill and actually train in a equality of access way?
Yeah, one of the very few good points coming out of the pandemic is that we've all learnt that online training is a good thing. It doesn't completely deal with every training need. And I also think it's important from a developmental point of view that people in a profession are able to get together at times. I think mobile training is often really useful as well when we take the trainer to the fishermen. Okay. So that's very much part of the plan.
You'll give weight to flexibility, like the mobile training online as well. They will be looked at and they will be enhanced. Very much so.
We are, as always, concerned about safety in this industry, and that will be very much part of this offer as well.
Okay, and also we've heard in previous evidence sessions, and it ties in with another inquiry that we're doing on rural mental health, but the mental health, the physical and mental well-being of fishing communities as well. Is that something that is going to be factored into this in terms of
so you go first.
I will go first. We are very much hearing that on the coast, particularly through the consultations that the Minister Prentice talked about previously. I don't think we are. It's a competitive bid, so if somebody wants to put in a bid for a training programme to increase resilience in the fleet or help people to identify diversification, then we will look at that.
Or mental health first aid training in the workplace.
Exactly that, that, Dr. Hudson. If any of that, we will look at that on the case-by-case basis.
Right.
But we are also doing a lot of work as DEFRA with the charity organisations, and we are talking to the other organisations to which some of the mental health issues might be arising because of. So we're trying to marry all that up to deliver something.
And make sure that we as government are not adding to people's stress, and are working with the really superb fishermen's charities to deliver mental health training where appropriate. My grandfather was a missions to seamen chaplain. So this is the stress in fishing communities is very much something that I was brought up to recognise. Geraint knows where I'm from, and, where my mother was from anyway. And I do think that the work done by those charities is modern and efficient and should be recognised as such. This is not necessarily the scheme to help with that, but if they wanted to make a bid, we certainly wouldn't stand in their way.
Thank you for shining a spotlight on those charities and that work that they do. That's great. Final question then is why is the scheme, the training and skills training side of things, is it not accessible to businesses to allow them to offer apprenticeships?
It is accessible to businesses,
okay.
But we are not looking at apprenticeships this time round. There is an apprenticeship that already exists in the fishing industry. So again, if somebody...
Businesses can apply, but they can't use it to fund an apprenticeship, is what you're saying. Okay. Is that something that could be looked at in the future then, or...?
It is. So interestingly, we had a really good conversation with someone from the Cornish Fisheries Producer Organisation last week, and yes, we are going to look at what that might look like in the future. No promises made, but what could be possible will be examined.
Traditionally, the fishing industry has not used the apprenticeship scheme in the way that perhaps it might. So we need to look at why that is.
Thank you.
I think, just to follow up on that, thank you, that one of the problems has been that if you're a share fisherman, you're not an employee, and if you're not an employee, you can't then do an apprenticeship, and a lot of the industry is still based on a share of the catch, which obviously gives you variable income. But I hope you might be able to look at whether share fishermen starting off in the job could have some sort of training apprenticeship.
We might look at a way of producer organisations, for example, taking responsibility for apprentices in the future. We've got 15,000 fishermen. Many of them have one vessel, and it's not been a model that's awfully worked with the apprenticeship model. So that is definitely something we're willing to look at. And if you, as a committee, have ideas, we'd love to receive those.
You mentioned the seafood exports package. It's only 1 million out of the 100 million. Why have you chosen to have it non-EU countries and missed out our closest and best market?
That's really, it's for both markets we already export to and markets we want to export to. I think we export £1.6 billion worth of seafood, thereabouts at the moment. 1.3 billion of that is to the EU. So we have very well-worn market access with parts of the EU. However, there are other markets within the EU that we do not yet reach, and we want to explore that. We also want to explore new markets. You'll all remember the difficulties our exporters had at the beginning of last year. I think it's very important that we have a wide range of markets available to what is, in fact, a very wide-ranging sector. We've talked a lot about the catching sector today, but aquaculture is a very big part of our export market.
Obviously, we've got people in embassies around the world promoting British food. This money won't be used just to pay those people already there. It's new money.
This is new money, and we will demand new returns on the new money.
And so for the million you're putting in, what amount of extra trade do you hope to generate?
I think we'll struggle to put a figure on that. There's so many different things at play, unfortunately. Things like, prices and stock sustainability, etc. So, but we've done an awful lot of work with DIT to figure out where we're likely to get most bang for our buck in those new markets in particular.
I mean, the biggest market for British caught fish, which is not really exploited by our own fish, is the UK market. We import most of the fish we eat, and we export most of the fish we can. I mean, are we really flogging a dead horse on persuading people to eat fish that isn't covered in batter or breadcrumbs?
No, you carry on, Sir Robert, and I carry on. You will have noticed it was very much part of the food strategy. Fish actually featured at every stage of that food strategy as part of what we're trying to promote. During the pandemic, we actually made some progress. We had a substantial fund which encouraged people who normally export to sell directly. The difficulty, of course, is that our fishermen understandably want to achieve the best prices for them. And those prices, particularly for the crabs and lobsters, are not in this country. But I love our seafood, and I'm terribly proud of our seafood, and think that we should do all we can to promote it among our fellow countrymen.
Yes, I mean, one legacy of my time in your position was every time I arrived somewhere they gave me oysters to eat, which I didn't used to really fancy, but actually I love oysters now. I love them now. I was completely weaned onto them. So, and if more people would eat British oysters and other fish that we catch,
I think that genuinely in the food strategy, the things like the new public procurement targets will really help British produce across the board. So we've just going out to consultation on that 50% goal of public procurement being local. So I'm very hopeful that British seafood becomes genuinely part of the national diet.
And bringing it all the way back to the UK Seafood Fund, the infrastructure pillar in particular, in order to get the seafood to the domestic consumer, we need to improve our domestic supply chains, and that is predominantly one of the things that the infrastructure scheme is looking at. So sort out what consumers want to eat on the one hand, make sure we can get the fish to them on the other, and we will.
And Brixham Market, I don't know if you've already heard evidence about this, but would repay a bit of investigation by the committee in this space. They made real progress during the course of the pandemic and drastically increased the amount of domestic selling that they did. So I think it would be worth using Brixham as an example.
We've actually got till past. I miscalculated.
So,
Geraint, you can finish us off.
Okay. Well, I won't talk about oysters, but you'll know oyster mouth, and we should be putting more in people's mouths. On the last question, just briefly, it does strike me that £1 million is a marketing budget on the back of a trade worth, 1,600 million, right? Namely, less than 0.1% is a very, very small amount to spend on marketing. I do remember some years ago, Unilever, I think, was spending £15 million just marketing PG tips. So don't you feel that we should be spending more than the million, both at home and abroad, to increase sales?
I haven't got the figures with me, but I think you'll find the Scottish salmon spend is really considerable, and do you know off the top of your head their market share increase in terms of our exports over the last few years has been really very impressive.
Okay, that's very good. So in other words, the 1 million then it's quite a small proportion of the total marketing. So, I mean, it's sort of icing on the cake? It's not going to make much of a difference, is it?
Well, I view the role of government is to help exporters with difficulties, with form filling, with barriers to trade. This is very much targeted at practical, on-the-ground help to encourage our exporters to get over specific difficulties with the market. Our agri-food counsellors across the board, we've now, I think we're recruiting 11, we're recruiting 8 extras, so I think we'll have 11 in total, are going to be very much part of that international work, if you like, and I fully expect there to be considerably more marketing spend by specific types of seafood.
It's also it's £1 million more. It's specific. You know, it's almost like a top up. It will not be the money that's used to pay for those 8 counsellors, for instance. It's additional money. So the agri-food counsellors would have already have a marketing role and will be reaping rewards. This is additional money to top that up. So
because if we're going into these big complicated markets like the CPT, PP or whatever, with many different sorts of people in many sorts of countries, and we're serious about that, then we will need a bit more bang to make our buck, won't we? In terms of the investment, both in market research and then in marketing. And I'm just saying that the £1 million doesn't go very far. I know that sounds a lot to people.
When taken across the board, with all of the DIT weight and effort behind it, and the Foreign Office weight and effort behind it, this is very much part of a much bigger picture.
Okay.
I think it will help. This is going to be targeted at specific problems with exporting.
Okay, coming back to the seafood funds and how they're allocated across the UK, I think Sarah mentioned that in the case where a devolved administration is already funding a project, that will be excluded. But it does strike me that they'd only be funding the best application in the first place. So doesn't that make it discriminatory in the sense that that would have been funded, because it was a good project, and in a way that money then will be displaced back into a non-devolved?
I don't think so. I think it's good that there are various streams available to our fishing industry. So we've got this 100 million scheme over 3 years. We've then got the repatriated EU funding of 32.7 million a year. So, adding it up, that's almost another 100 million, if you see what I mean, over the 3-year period. That was already organised into schemes which are delivered via the devolved administrations and by England, and those schemes are well understood by the fishing industry and are often smaller and more targeted at individual fishermen. So I'm not anticipating difficulties with that. There's one bit of clarification I should do, which is that you can apply for the same scheme, if you like, within different funds. You will just get funded once. We are working extremely closely with the DAs on these schemes, and I have no doubt that that will work properly as it should do.
Because one could argue that the fund should be sort of proportionately distributed to the 4 nations to start with, because otherwise they may have funded something from their original
Well, the other work stream
that then is being displaced. Do you see what I mean? So they lose out.
So the repatriated funding is provided by the DAs and by England, but this 100 million seafood fund that we're here to talk about today was very much viewed as a project to bring the industry together, to get us ready for the opportunities which came our way, and to modernise us and make sure that we were fishing in a sustainable way as a united UK.
It wasn't just the Prime Minister trying to sweeten the pill that was a little bit bitter for the fishing industry and to sort of address their disappointment at the deal?
I think it was an extremely useful fund, and I'm very happy to be responsible for spending it.
Right, and on as it were, on the sort of EU landscape, do you feel that the amount that's being provided and the way it's being spent is sort of competitive with the amount of support that's been given to, I don't know, French fishermen and other fisher.
Well, of course, Sir Robert was just then being a bit sniffy about the TCA. I think it's fair, technical term. I think it's fair to say that the industry abroad was even more upset by the TCA than we were. So it's. I think it's fair to say that there are gains for our industry in the TCA, and there's definitely an uplift in quota, and we've been very pleased to give that in particular to the inshore fleet, and I've been pleased with the way that's gone. So I have noticed that other countries have wanted possibly to sweeten the pill for their industries, to coin a phrase. I think what we're doing is comparable. You should view it as part of the schemes in total. So 100 million under this fund over 3 years and about 100 million under the repatriated funds over 3 years. I think that's a really significant investment by government in the future of our fishing industry, and we should be really pleased with that.
But how does that compare, on a like-for-like basis with some of our main competitors?
Well, it's very hard to compare like for like, not least because they are losing quota and we are gaining quota. And the aim of this fund is to get us ready to catch the extra quota that's coming our way.
Right. I think I might. I'm just wondering whether to leave it there or to basically ask on the specifics of the funding streams from the fishing and seafood scheme in England and the marine fund in Scotland. And isn't there a problem here? And plus the fact that other money may be spent in other ways involve administration. Isn't there a sort of possibility of a bit of confusion here?
No, I don't think so. As I said earlier, those funds are very well understood by our fishing industry. They're very happy to bid into them. They're open to much smaller bids than those we've opened under this fund to date. And I don't think there is. I mean, there may be confusion among the general public, but I think among the fishing industry that it's very well understood. Would you agree?
Completely. And I think the thing to labour there is that, so as Minister Prentice says, the repatriated funds, the schemes there, they are very similar to what we used to do under the EU. Not the same. We've obviously taken advantage of the fact that we can do in our own areas what we want to do, but they are schemes that the local fishermen know very well can utilise. The UK Seafood Fund, in its development, we worked really closely with the devolved administrations to make really clear water between what you would normally go to if in a domestic scheme to fund and what you should go to for a UK Seafood Fund. And the big difference is the scale. So you tend to go to the domestic scheme, so both the Fisheries and Seafood Scheme in England and the Marine Scotland Fund, you go for smaller projects. Whereas the infrastructure pillar, for instance, you're looking at projects worth 250,000 to 5 million. That's not something that the Marine Scotland Fund is sort of in the same bracket of.
And finally, can I just ask, I don't know whether you've got the figures, but if you were to look at the size of the market and the value of the market going to British fishers in, say, 2018 or 2019, something like that, and what is projected to be in the next year, is there a big difference? Has it gone down much since the Brexit experience?
The size of the export market?
Well, the total market and also the export market, yeah, separate questions really.
They are figures that I look at regularly. I wouldn't like to remember them wrongly. I am very happy to write to the committee, if that would be helpful, Sir Robert, on projected sales. I think that's what you're asking.
Yeah, I mean, in a generality, though, is exports basically for British fish, if I can call them that, are down. Is that correct?
No. We in some areas we continue to have significant difficulties, and we are still working hard. For example, in the live bivalve mollusk sector and the eel sector, for example. Just to take two examples, fine to export from Class A waters, but not from Class B waters. Yeah. And the rest of our export market is holding up very well, and prices are really good at the moment. And of course, that's why I have some hesitation in sharing figures, because there's always the volume figure and then the value figure, and one is, well, they're both worth tracking, but separately. So in value terms, we're doing very, very well at the moment. And if you look at our global sales, particularly on the Scottish salmon side, for example, that it's really growing extremely satisfactorily. So it's a very broad and complex market. And I think it's something, well, this is why it is worth putting investment into this industry. I do want us to eat more at home, I really do, but I also think that this is a valuable export.
Finally, how many, I don't know, is employment growth likely to grow or shrink in the fishing sector?
Well...
We're not talking Filipinos and Ghanaians, by the way.
I think the Skills and Training Fund is very much part of our emphasis to try and upskill and make a career for a local workforce, and a workforce that views this as perhaps not for life, but for a good few years as part of their life plan, as it were. There are many opportunities in fish, but not just in catching. A lot of our value in fish, about half, is in aquaculture, though a very small proportion of the workforce is employed in aquaculture. So it's hard for me to give an exact answer without splitting it into sections.
I'll leave it there, Chair.
Before I'm going to take Neil, just could you maybe drop us a line about the eel situation, and particularly as it affects Northern Ireland in Lough Neagh, and also the glass eel trade?
I would be delighted.
Very helpful. And could you copy that into Simon Hall, the chair of the Northern Ireland Select Committee, because they take an interest in that as well?
Yes, they do, as do the colleagues from Gloucestershire.
Yes.
Where the eels originate, and I've been keeping them updated, Sir Robert, but possibly not the EFRA committee in the way that I should have been.
Neil.
Minister, we just touched there on some of the difficulties of moving products, and we're trying to sort of help our industries. Can I just ask you DEFRA's perspective on, I've been calling for the UK and the EU to get round the table and think very seriously about signing a veterinary and SPS agreement. Can I just get DEFRA's perspective on that? But do you feel that would help a lot of the situation in terms of movement of seafood, but also animal and plant products? It would help a lot of the GB Northern Ireland side of things as well. But what is DEFRA doing about that? I've raised that with Foreign Office, Northern Ireland Office. Is DEFRA on board with that?
We are, the TCA allows for a VetMeds or similar agreement, SPS agreement. As far as we're concerned, we like trading with the EU. We think our products are safe and fantastic, and they should be as easy to export now as they were before we left the EU. We are frustrated by the attitude that some of our friends in the EU have taken, particularly, for example, in the live bivalve mollusk space. We continue to work very, very closely. We have a stream of work set out in the TCA for this specialised committee on fisheries. We're very much engaged with that. In some ways, things are going well. In digitalisation, for example, of export health certificates, we have actually made real progress, and things have got much easier. But there is a long way to go, and I'm quite sure that when relationships improve and the situation continues to evolve, that things can get better.
I see your frustrations there, but do you see that there could be a direction of travel that the UK government could get behind in terms of a veterinary SPS agreement?
My perspective is we are doing absolutely everything we can to try to make things as easy for our traders as we possibly can.
But if we had a veterinary SPS agreement, do you agree that
well,
that
certainly
would
not
help
us
things?
Standing in the way of it.
But it would help the situation.
Well, but the problem is not us. It's some of our former partners who do not wish to make the changes that we think would be perfectly sensible.
Okay, thank you.
Just very quickly, finally, obviously the EU's equivalent scheme, MFAF, runs from 2021 to 2027. How long will the UK's equivalent scheme run for? And if it's due to expire before that, will you be making representations that nice Mr. Sunak, who has, I was going to say has the hold of the money, but he has the country's credit card in effect, to try and extend it.
This is for the repatriated funding.
No, I was talking about
or for the seafood fund as well.
A follow-on scheme.
So, the funding we have got, the UK Seafood Fund, is due to end. It's £100 million that is due to end by March 2025. Okay. In answer to your question, would we be making repatriations to the Treasury for more money? I think it will depend on how successful...
This is a common system.
What we managed to achieve, how successful the scheme has been and what is left at the end of it. We're obviously all wanting to be in a world where the industry is not reliant on government funding. The aim of this scheme is to make the industry self-sustaining. Where we are at the end of that, we'll need to then decide.
It will also very much depend on what we're expecting to get in 2026.
Okay, thank you. If you've no objection, Minister, or members of the committee, could I suggest we put your slide pack on the committee's
No, but I think that would be a very good thing.
So those watching in can actually, it won't be up straight away, but we'll get it on today. So if they want to look at the detail there, which I think is very helpful.
It is very much simplified, and there is much more information available for those who want to apply for the fund on the various gov.uk websites. But I think it is quite helpful for the general viewer, as it were. Yeah,
and I hope that people who've been listening will understand. I mean, I didn't realise that recreational sector, which is a lot of charter fishermen in my constituency, take people out. They also complain the toilets aren't open at 6 o'clock in the morning when they set out.